Wow, what a video to start to. I feel like Kevin said his heart was racing. He's ready to go for a run now. So do you just want to go for a little jog around and we'll come back here in a few minutes?
Yeah, definitely, for the win. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to see lots of familiar faces and some new faces as well. If we've not met before, my name is Andrew Yeh. I am the Deputy Director at the China Strategic Risk Institute. For those of you who haven't come across our work before, CSRI is a new think tank. We are based in London. We launched earlier this year, and we are working to assess the strategic challenges posed by China across geopolitics, economics, and security. We are delighted to be the regional partner for the Doublethink Lab China Index for the UK and Australia, and we'll be presenting some of our findings shortly, but I'll hand over to Kevin to introduce himself.
Thank you, Andrew. So my name's Kevin Mooney. I'm the Canberra Regional Liaison for IPAC, so the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. We have over 30 co-chairs across the world, and we've just recently had our conference in Prague, where we've set out a communique for kind of what we're doing for the next 12 to 18 months. So I'll hand back.
Great, so this session is briefly divided into three sections. So we'll first look at what we found to be changing or comparing between the UK and Australia in terms of the PRC's influence in those countries, as with our analysis on the Doublethink Lab Index. We'll then spend some time looking at the policy response. So how have the UK and Australia tried to deal with some of these issues, and how does that compare? And then ends just with some brief recommendations and future trends to watch. And of course, we're really looking forward to hearing your questions and your input. I just want to highlight the expertise of several individuals in this room. Obviously, we have Martin Thorley, who just spoke, an expert on the UK scene, as well as Sam Dunning and Sam Hogg standing at the back there. So hopefully we can hear from some of them later as well. And I'm sure there are many Australia experts in the room as well, Kevin.
Well, we're lucky to have John Fitzgerald as well at the back.
Of course, yes.
And the incoming chair for Doublethink is also an Australian as well, which is great.
Great, and any covert experts hidden, we're looking forward to hearing from you too. So Kevin, over to you.
So, thank you very much. So we're just starting off with Australia and the PRC, People's Republic of China, impact on Australia. So there was actually, Australia featured quite heavily this morning, and we didn't kind of realise that. So we found that quite interesting. We kind of picked up some similar trends to kind of what was mentioned this morning. So just as it's happened. So Australia, the PRC has a big impact in terms of on the Australian economy. PRC is Australia's largest kind of trading partner, particularly in regards to iron ore, coal, and somewhat with LPG, so natural resources, raw minerals. So it's a different exposure than the UK has. It's resulted in quite interesting reactions to sort of foreign policy and domestic policy. So obviously Australia is kind of a bit of an example in terms of economic coercion, the impact that cutting off trade with Australia. It's kind of been seen around the world, whether that's in Europe with Lithuania as well. There's kind of some other examples. So it's quite interesting at the time when that was happening. So I remember kind of you were able to eat a lobster buy a lobster for $20 for Christmas and that sort of thing. It was quite an odd time where a lot of products that Australia would usually send overseas were a lot cheaper for the domestic market. And obviously that had a massive impact on the suppliers as well. So even though the PRC's had a massive impact on the Australian economy, that hasn't necessarily had an impact on Australian foreign policy more broadly. And you can kind of track that between different political parties as well. So within the last kind of 3 years, there's been a change of government in Australia, and the argument could be made that the foreign policy settings haven't necessarily changed. Some of the discussion around kind of what in terms of where Australian foreign policy and how we deal with the People's Republic of China has changed, but in terms of the actual policy settings, that hasn't really there hasn't been an outcome in regards to that. However, there have definitely been risks in terms of the impact of the PRC in Australia. And I'll move in terms of the next slide. So foreign interference in Australia was kind of highlighted quite early on. In terms of the impact of that, there was a number of scandals in terms of the political sphere. We've kind of listed a couple of examples, but so Senator Sam Dastyari was a very prominent senator from the state of New South Wales in Australia, which is the largest state, which has quite a substantial kind of mainland Chinese Australian population. In terms of he took money to basically pay off debts that he'd incurred, and there'd been a number of scandals leading up to that. So he'd also had gotten up at a press conference and talked about freedom of navigation and not necessarily being on board with freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, which was a contradiction at the time to his party's policy, which is very interesting. So Senator Dastyari taking that money led to him actually resigning as a senator and a politician in Australia. There was another example where $100,000 in cash was actually delivered to his branch of his political party, literally in kind of plastic bags, in shopping bags. And so you can see that even though the foreign policy settings in Australia haven't changed, there have definitely been issues that have arisen in terms of foreign interference, and very prominent issues indeed. So in terms of these issues, they were found by the kind of Anti-Corruption Commission. They weren't necessarily found by an organisation with a China-specific focus. They were found as part of the general anti-corruption mechanisms that are in Australia. Excellent.
All good. Great. So just to pick out a few areas where I think the UK is quite unique in terms of China's influence and soft power. So the UK has one of the world's largest university sectors. It is the country in the world which has the second most universities in the world top 100, second only to the USA, and in a much smaller country size. And we also see huge numbers of Chinese and Hong Kong students coming to the UK each year, around 150,000 each year coming to study. And we have seen these influence attempts really come through in the data that we have done as part of the Doublethink Lab Index. So for example, with Australia has a much closer economic relationship with China compared to the UK. The volume of Chinese trade in imports and exports is much more significant than it is for the UK, and we see that borne out through the Doublethink Lab data, whereas Australia scores 24 out of 48 on the economic sphere indicator, the UK scores just 8. So it's not so significant in economic link, but on academia, that scores as the UK's highest domain. So they're compared to the military, law enforcement, society, and these other domains in the Doublethink Lab Index, academia comes by far the largest level of influence. So just to highlight a few areas through which that influence is exerted, two particular pressure points I want to talk about. Firstly, the link between Chinese military-linked institutions and UK universities. There has been lots of great work done on this already, and there are numerous examples to highlight. But just a recent one came out last week, I believe, due to the good work of Sam and others, around the Imperial College London, which is one of the world's leading universities, and the Jiangsu Automation Research Institute. They were developing artificial intelligence technology to control drone ships together. So that's a clear strategic risk in terms of a UK university helping a Chinese institute with links to China's People's Liberation Army in developing a sensitive technology area. And we see that both in terms of funding streams, but also in terms of joint research institutes set up between UK universities and companies or universities linked to the Chinese military. The second area I'll highlight is the surveillance, intimidation, and harassment of Chinese and Hong Kong students studying in the UK. Two pointers to look at in this respect are the Confucius Institutes and the Chinese Student Scholar Associations. So the UK actually has the world's highest number of Confucius Institutes. It's got 30 across the country, and nearly all major universities have a Chinese Student Scholar Association. Why do these matter? Well, for Confucius Institutes, they are broadly seen as an arm of Chinese government propaganda, as many of you will know, but also a potential point for surveillance and censorship within the university as well. Perhaps more egregiously, but less well studied, is the role of Chinese Student Scholar Associations. There are cases both in Australia and in the UK of CSSAs being used through their link with the Chinese embassy to monitor what Chinese students are doing on campus, particularly those who, for example, choose to take part in protests on campus and then may be threatened by members of the CSSA or threatened that they will be monitored and their information sent back to the embassy, and so on. So those are just two areas that I would like to highlight, and I'll hand over back to Kevin.
Yep, so as mentioned previously, talking about foreign interference in Australia, we haven't seen the impact on foreign affairs policy or direction, but we have definitely seen issues that have arisen. And so, as you can see, there's quite a large number of legislation that's been put in place in Australia to deal with this issue of foreign interference. And it starts in kind of 2017 and goes kind of all the way to kind of 2020 in terms of that was the sphere of time where we were pushing through a lot of foreign interference legislation and arguably kind of ahead of the game in terms of the Western world. These are the kind of earliest such kind of counter-foreign interference laws across the Western world, and that started in Australia. Yep. Ooh. There we go. Yep. So in terms of this legislation, it's actually been active. So the first time somebody got charged in terms of foreign interference was in 2020. As part of that, the suite of legislation that was in place, Australia's banned Huawei and ZTE from participating in the 5G rollout in Australia. That happened in 2018. Another one of the actions that took place was actually stopping individual state governments from signing agreements with the PRC. So there's a memorandum of understanding signed by a particular state government with the PRC in terms of BRI and the Belt and Road Initiative. And so there was legislation put in place to basically take this power away from the individual state governments and let that sit solely with the federal government. And as Andrew highlighted previously, in terms of the UK, Australia's also had there's been quite a significant impact on the Australian university scene as well, whether that's with Confucius Institutes or individual agreements between universities in Australia and the PRC.
Great. So just a quick response on what has the UK government done to try and address some of these challenges. There have been a variety of what I would refer to as half measures to try and deal with this. So for example, returning to the question of UK university collaboration with Chinese military partners, there has been a strengthened vetting regime. So in the UK, if you are studying a potentially sensitive subject at an advanced level, you have to go through what's called the ATAS certification scheme. To give you an idea of how there has been a bit of a crackdown in this regard, in 2020, 128 people, prospective students, were denied visas under the ATAS certification scheme. By 2022, that had risen to 1,100 people. So you're jumping from 128 to 1,100. That's clearly no coincidence. It's not that the risk has necessarily increased much. It's just that the government is looking much more stringently at what risks there might be. So there is some attempt to regulate in that respect. However, many of the joint research centres between UK universities and institutions linked to the Chinese military, while many of them have closed, many of them continue to operate in terms of individual collaborations between the researchers involved, and many of the funding streams still remain open. There's a report last week out, I think from the Civitas group, which noted that up to a third of funding into UK universities from China is potentially linked back through to the People's Liberation Army. So there is still a huge problem in that respect. With regards to the Confucius Institutes and CSSAs, Confucius Institutes have not been banned in the UK like they have been in the US and elsewhere. It is more, the one step the government has made is it said it will take away funding from Confucius Institutes. However, when we asked the government the month they made that announcement, how many Confucius Institutes have you funded in the last year? They said, well, we didn't fund any. So taking away the funding doesn't seem that significant. And then in terms of CSSAs, my understanding is that it's meant to come under the purview of what's called the Defending Democracy Task Force, which is a new UK government initiative. But as of yet, there are no kind of significant actions with regards to the monitoring Chinese government surveillance of the diaspora on campus.
Yep. So in terms of this section, we're talking about kind of future trends and recommendations. So as you could see before, there's been a large number of legislation passed through in Australia in terms of foreign interference. And this is actually currently, well, it's just been reviewed by the Joint Security and Intelligence Committee. And so in terms of IPAC, one of our Australian co-chairs, Peter Khalil, is the chair of that committee, and sort of led that review. And so as part of that review, there hasn't been any recommendations to change that legislation at this stage. There was some issues in regards to that legislation. So, for example, whether it's compliance burden, but also the fact that the legislation, including the the foreign interference legislation that lists people who potentially were involved with foreign interference, the registrar, it's not necessarily comprehensive, and it doesn't necessarily list all the people who would be involved with foreign interference, and so that gap is important to note. There's also the issue around the CPTPP, Comprehensive Progressive Agreement for Pacific Partnership. I know a lot of you would know about that trade agreement. Australia, as a signatory to that, would have to approve Taiwan being involved in that agreement, being part of that trade partnership, but also the People's Republic of China as well.
Great. We are fast running out of time. I think we started a bit late, but just kind of three questions, I think, for the UK policy space. Firstly, will Chinese student scholar associations and Confucius Institutes be allowed to kind of continue unchecked on university campuses? Will the UK learn from Australia's experience of implementing the Foreign Agents Registration Scheme? So the UK is getting its own version of that act shortly. The details are yet to be published. Will we learn from some of those shortfalls, as Kevin outlined, in terms of lacking a comprehensive listing of everyone that might need to be covered? And the Defending Democracy Task Force I mentioned earlier, which is supposedly the government's strategy to deal with United Front interference, what will that lead to achieving? I think we have a couple of minutes, 3 minutes, for any quick questions, so please keep them short and snappy and we will go to them. Yeah, we've got one here, and then I'll also go here. Ben, do you want to go?
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Kevin. Really, really interesting. I want to ask about, so I see, is it on? Yeah, okay. I see in UK maybe there haven't been as robust policy implementation legislation that is in the way you want, but in Australia we saw that with legislation about anti-interference. I wonder if you could, for my own lack of knowledge, briefly just explain what that entails. I understand there's like foreign agent registry, there is the ability to abrogate investment agreements, BRI-linked investment agreements. I do know you didn't mention this, that scholars have to declare funding. I remember this when I engaged with an Australian scholar. What else is there, and what has worked and what has failed? Because it's very difficult to do this kind of legislation.
Yeah, really good question. So, that's why the review's just been put in place, because we're still kind of working that out ourselves. So in terms of the registrar, so for example, former prime ministers who give speeches to foreign governments are on the registrar. Is that really a good use of our time or their time? Maybe not. So that's why they've currently done the review. There hasn't been any, the legislation hasn't been amended to do that review, but it has been highlighted that there is a need to change that. I think something that wasn't included in this but is really important is the foreign direct investment setup that we have. So if there's a foreign direct investment by a company from overseas, PRC, US, France, wherever, that goes through a process by itself. And so, for example, when a Hong Kong government or Hong Kong a company was trying to buy an electricity provider that would actually provides the electricity to an American installation in Australia, it was judged that that was a risk to foreign. That was a risk in terms of national security, and so that wasn't able to pass through. Same thing applies to whether it's farmland or other companies or whatever that are Australian or Australian real estate, that sort of thing.
Cool. I think we had one question down here. How much time do we have left? Time's very good questions.
Yeah, it might be a quick answer too. For the CSSAs at these universities, have you found that, and I'm not familiar with how they're structured or how they work or anything like that, just that they exist in these universities. Are there official CCP members or official security personnel that operate in them? And then have you, as a supplementary, if yes, has there been direct examples where they've been found to be monitoring members of the Chinese diaspora that are at these universities?
Yeah, so the main concern is the link through to the local embassies and the extent to which membership of the CSSA, or particularly leadership of the CSSA, is linked to the local embassy. The best report to read, to my knowledge, that others might recommend others, would be the Human Rights Watch report into Australian CSSAs in Australia. And there are some very disturbing accounts of monitoring of the Uyghur, Hong Kong, or another diaspora there. So I'd look into that. Right, I think our time is up. Thank you so much for coming, and hope to see you soon.